Welcome to HR Studio Podcast. Through bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond, we invite you to listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com.
Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to HR Studio Podcast. My name is Fred Bunsa, and I'm going to be your host for today's episode. Today, we are joined by Doug Claffey. Doug is the CEO and one of the co-founders of an organization called Energize, which works with organizations around their culture and their becoming a top workplace. He has the distinction of being the very first rocket scientist that we've interviewed on the podcast. So for all those rocket scientists out there, you're going to be hearing from one of your own. But Doug spent many years in the aerospace industry before actually moving into more of a consulting role. He actually worked at McKinsey. I'd like to hear a little bit of that journey. But in their organizational practice area, he spent a number of years there before founding or co-founding Energage back in 2006. And Doug, I want to welcome you to HR Studio Podcast.
Thanks so much, Fred. Really delighted to be here.
Doug, what I wanted to talk about today for our audience of rising HR leaders is the whole idea behind workplace culture and employee engagement. It's become such a big topic with our clients and the people that we're talking to. I know you all have run the top workplace survey, so let's just start with some of the basics. How do you actually become a top workplace?
So there's really two answers to that. One is, how do you become a great place to work in? And then the other is, how do you get recognized as a top workplace? So the first step in becoming and creating a great culture, a top workplace for employees, is about really four different imperatives. The first one is to be aligned around where the company's going. The second one is about a sense of connection. So employees feel that real deep emotional sense of connection with the company. The third one is around a coaching environment where managers are coaching their employees and employees are coaching each other. And then the last one is around performing. So you can't have a great place to work if the company's not really outperforming the competition. So those are the big four that create a top workplace. Now, to get recognized as a top workplace, you got to go find someone who's going to be an independent measurer of your culture. And so that's where Energage and the Top Workplaces program comes in.
Okay. I want to talk about some of those four areas, but before I do, just give us the quick story of how did you get from aerospace to employee workplace and culture, because that seems like quite a jump.
Happy to share that. I would say that, to be fair, I'm no longer a rocket scientist. I might be a recovering rocket scientist.
Good, fair enough.
So my journey started out in the aerospace business at GE when they had 400,000 employees. And I just felt like a very small fish in a giant pond and very difficult to get anything done. It took me 6 months to get one piece of equipment ordered there. And I said, I can't make this work for me. So I joined a startup. It was a seven-person aerospace startup. And we were able to grow that company from 7 people up to around 150 or so with about $20 million in revenue over the course of the next few years. And I filled all kinds of different roles there. But when I looked around, my passion wasn't really aerospace like all the rocket scientists around me. It was how people work together. So went to McKinsey, worked in their org practice for a few years and enjoyed that work, but ultimately wanted to be very focused on making the world a better place to work together. And so the way to do that was to found Energage, which was then called Workplace Dynamics. And so founded that 12 years ago with this mission of making the world a better place to work together. And so that was the kind of quick skinny on how I got from rocket scientist to making the world a better place to work together.
That's pretty cool. Follow your heart, not your wallet, I always say to people. So direction, connection, coaching, and performance, you would say those are kind of the four key links or the drivers of having a top workplace?
Yeah, the first one I'd really say is alignment. So
Okay.
direction is a component of that, but really alignment is being aligned is the key.
Okay. And is there a sequence there? Like if you were going to work with an organization, or if our listeners who are largely in HR leaders, but any kind of leader, would they start with alignment and then go to connection, coaching, and performance, or are you working on all four of them simultaneously?
The first thing is to find out where you stand on those four different dimensions, and then pick just one to work on at a time. So it's not so simple. There's not a one size fits all. Everybody start with values, for example, which is an alignment driver. But it does depend on a diagnostic. So find out where you stand first, and then form a plan. But forming a plan without a diagnostic doesn't really actually work very well or make a lot of sense.
Okay. And that's your organization has built that diagnostic. Tell us a little bit about the database and what the data will often show an organization.
Sure. So we've surveyed about 50,000 organizations over the last 12 years, about 14 million employees, and we have roughly 500 million data points from those employees on workplace and culture. And they span across those four imperatives and 15 drivers of culture, as well as 7 different kind of hygiene factors around pay and benefits and training and that kind of thing. And so the process is to take the survey and then that benchmarks against the data set. And then we use something called high stakes math, which is a really unique and distinct kind of way of understanding your survey data to find out where you're doing really well and where you ought to focus your efforts. And so that's the first step is that diagnostic.
Okay. And from your experience in working with organizations, when you bring in the data, what gets in the way? What are some of the obstacles that can get in the way of implementing that, whether you're coming in as a consultant from the outside or you're an HR leader presenting the data? What have you seen that can sabotage the efforts to change the culture?
Well, this is going to sound kind of funny, but the first thing that gets in the way is survey math and the numbers associated with survey math. So what we find is that often the initial challenge you run into is when you show too many numbers associated with survey math, and often you'll see, and maybe we even historically used to show a lot of numbers, we'd show maybe an average of the ordinals around agreeing and disagreeing. We'd show percentiles. We'd show percent strongly engaged, percent disengaged. People would quote numbers like a 3.17 on alignment. And ultimately those for factors which are inherently don't have a metric associated with them, it ends up sort of paralyzing the discussion. So you end up with arguments about, well, what does this number mean and what does this improvement mean? And so what we've done and spent a lot of time and research in is create visualizations that put the numbers underneath the visualization so you can get to the story right away. And so that is a kind of a quick barrier. And the more technical or financial or numerically literate the manager is, or the team is, the worse it gets, because they want to dive deep down into the numbers.
Interesting.
And ultimately, we're talking about people and culture and soft skills. We're not talking about a financial number or an operating number around safety or something like that. So numbers get in the way first. The second thing that we'll often see is the people who are struggling the most, whether it's a department or an area of those drivers, is defensiveness. And so if you start out with I'm going to get defensive around these numbers, and you have a culture that already is in blame or in a toxic place, it can be hard for people to hold up a mirror and see that.
It's interesting. It actually reminds me, I mean, we do a lot of executive coaching in our organization, and the same two factors can get in the way there. A 360 survey, people can start challenging the numerical outputs and the ratings and the scores, and then in the written comments, they can get very defensive and start explaining, well, this is why they're writing these things, and it can really obfuscate the broader conversation of, as well, people are saying this, what should we do about it? And so I imagine you have similar conversations with leaders when you're looking at a cultural survey is yes, we can talk about, and probably you can dive into all the permutations and combinations of the numbers, but the real discussion is around what do you think this all means and what should you do about it?
That's exactly right. There's a term that Sheila Heen and Doug Stone up at the Harvard Negotiation Project came up with called wrong spotting, which I really like. And so when you get the feedback, instead of being open to the feedback, you start it by finding all the things that are wrong with the feedback. So in terms of that getting the senior leadership team to be open to this kind of culture feedback, very often that starts with two key folks, the CEO or the leader of the organization, and then very often it's the head of HR. And I know that's the audience for today's podcast, but we think of that as the people suite as opposed to the C-suite. And that people suite are the kind of key people on this, or the folks on the C-suite who care the most about their people. And so that's usually the CEO, head of HR, and then often it could be either the COO or the CFO. And then every once in a while, it could be the head of manufacturing or the head of marketing. But there's typically 2 or 3 people on the senior leadership team for whom that the culture and people proposition is more of a passion than it is for the rest of the C-suite.
And so, Doug, what would you suggest for our podcast listeners who do care deeply about the people and the culture and the organization, and they're meeting resistance from a senior leader, whatever level she's at or he's at? What are some ways you've seen leaders like that effectively make the business case for why it's important to pay attention to culture and these kinds of measures?
So that's a great question. Typically, it does start with the most senior leader of that organization, whether it's the CEO of a company or if you're in a large division or an operating unit of a larger conglomerate. And there's 2 levels of how these folks get this or not. One is an emotional one where the person may already be bought into having a great culture, and so it doesn't take much. It could be that they're on the edge where they're up for being convinced, and there may be that they're dead set against it. And I'd say that if you're out there in this audience, and you need to assess which one of the 3 those are, because it can be very hard to get somebody from completely, sort of negative, toxic, or against culture. And in that case, that can be a tough place to turn around. So for the other 2 groups, and then the intellectual argument is around what is our return on investment going to be around culture? What is the difference that culture can make? And we know from our research that top workplaces outperform an average company by about 30% in total return, or total shareholder return. And so that's a combination of stock price and dividends, and sort of, if you put $100 in, over time, you're going to get a 30% higher return each year on average from a top workplace. So that often helps to move things along. Now, from an intuitive sense, many of the businesses that are now generating the profits in this company are knowledge businesses, and even manufacturing businesses, which years ago weren't really thought of as knowledge businesses. That's where the advantage comes. And so from a intuitive sense, if I'm going to take one group that is engaged and wants to come to work and is putting in their discretionary effort at one company or one department or one division, and pair them up against another one where they're disengaged, they can't wait to leave to work at 5 o'clock, they aren't aligned, don't feel a sense of connection, then that one is not going to perform very well. And so that discussion around business outcomes and then tying it to specific behaviors, to employee retention, to their getting that discretionary effort, usually people will start to come along and figure out that they need to invest some time in that. Now, the other thing, and we'll get to this maybe a little bit later, but in an environment where employment is so tight, that conversation is a lot easier than it was, say, 10 years ago.
Yes, I can imagine when you started 12 years ago and going through the Great Recession and all the rest, there was a whole different way of looking at this, because people were just grateful to have a job, and there wasn't a lot of attention paid to how happy they were. They were just here and working hard so that they wouldn't get let go in the next downturn. So A much different environment we're seeing out there. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. When we went through the first internet bubble back in the early 2000s, we had this crazy employment crunch, particularly in the tech sector, and we had the pendulum was very much in the employee side. When we got to that Great Recession, that 2008, 2009, and the jobless recovery, the pendulum had swung all the way back to the employer, and companies split up into two groups. There was the top workplaces, and we really studied them during that time as well as now, and they doubled down on taking care of their people because they knew that people were feeling a lot of pain. The folks that they had to let go were feeling a tremendous amount of pain. The folks that were remaining and had to do more were feeling a lot of pain. And so in order to sustain the business and to keep it as healthy as they could in those circumstances, they said, we got to really focus on culture and on our workplace and on ensuring that we're aligned and that that we still have that sense of connection through this difficult time. Then the other kind of company said, hey, you know what, you should feel lucky to have a job. We can be have poor behaviors. We can treat people like widgets. We can be impersonal. And those companies, by and large, really struggled through the Great Recession or are gone. And then as things turned around, people had reasonably long memories. And when the time came that they could get a job elsewhere, they certainly went off and got that job elsewhere.
Yeah, they took the immediate opportunity to go find greener pastures.
Exactly.
Doug, tell us a little bit about what you've seen in the 12 years and even prior when you were with with other consulting firms. What changes have you seen in terms of how people either view culture or try to leverage culture, their engagement with, no pun intended, but their engagement with culture? How have you seen that change?
So we've seen some really big waves in American business and in business in the world in trying to find that next source of competitive advantage. And so there was a huge quality movement early in my career, which was in the late 80s and kind of early 90s around TQM. And then we saw these big technology waves of putting in place your ERP system back in the 90s, and then putting in place your CRM system and Salesforce in the aughts. And in terms of a big trend, we're seeing that this movement towards people and culture as a source of sustainable competitive advantage is this next giant wave.
Okay.
And so that's really good news for the audience today, because right at the center of that is the HR profession. And so HR didn't have as much of a role in ERP or TQM or that CRM role, but the HR profession is dead center in this people or culture or employee engagement or employee experience. They're all different kind of terms around it that is now front and center as a source of competitive advantage. 10 years ago, not the case at all. 10 years ago, it was not at this macro sense. So 10 years ago, it was people trying to figure out how to just hold on. And so the things we saw in our top workplaces back then were leadership demonstrating that they understood how people really felt on the front lines. And so this may cast some of our memories back, but you had leadership going out, and instead of having a big Christmas party, because there wasn't really the money for that, and that was going to cost somebody a job, there'd be a barbecue with hot dogs where the leadership actually went out and did it and made the hot dogs themselves. They certainly made sure from a clarity perspective that leadership wasn't getting bonuses, that if people were taking pay cuts in order to sustain the business, that they were doing that as well.
Right.
They were making sure that if you were on the leaving side of the business, that you were treated as humanely as the business could, and that if you were on the staying part of the business, that you understood that where your level of safety was, where the boundaries were, and that you were important to the future of the business, and not ideally at risk of a pink sheet on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
But now, huge swing to today, where there has been a wave of focusing on perks. So we got to have the ping pong tables and the on-site daycare, things like that. That
Right.
kind of
Free oatmeal.
The middle. Sorry.
I said you have to offer free oatmeal.
Free oatmeal. What's what are your snacks? And so there's still a little bit of that now, but we've seen less focus on. So I'd say that was in the middle 3 years out of that 12, and then and it was kind of like how can I buy engagement? How can I just write a check to engage my employees? And that doesn't work either. It's more of a symptom of a great workplace than it is causal. And so when you really care about your employees and they care about those things, you'll start to see people spending on that. And so now in this last couple of years, we've started to see companies really get the culture's at the center of this, that being intentional about your culture is how you can create competitive advantage. And if you're not intentional about your culture, then you're going to be accidental about it and you're going to be a victim of your culture. The other thing that has been a big trend over the last few years is that you can't hide a bad culture. And so places like Glassdoor have put a light on bad cultures. Places like Top Workplaces and the Great Places to Work Institute and others have shined a light on great cultures. And so that's been another sort of mega trend within this kind of culture space.
And Doug, would you say that it's tougher for companies to get onto that top workplace list, or is it tougher to stay there once you're there?
So they're both tough. And I guess I'd say that there's no way to sort of pick between one of those in terms of which one is tougher than the other. But what really is tough is if you're an awful workplace, is to become a great one. Like that's hard. Now you can go from awful to good to better to great, but you really want to start out with finding out where you stand. And so if you ask me, Doug, how fast are you going to run a marathon next week? What's your time going to be? I'd say, well, I don't run marathons. I'm not ready to do that. And so the progress in almost every case it's a journey. You get better, you get better, you get better, but you don't go from awful to awesome in a year.
So prepare yourself for a longer journey to move along in the progression from good to great in a workplace culture.
Yeah, find out where you stand, and then you have a better sense of where you want to get to from there. And so I wouldn't say I don't want it to sound like it's a slog, because each stage along the way is better than the last one. And
sure.
So that's the journey to start to think about.
Yeah, and do you? We're almost at the end of our time together, unfortunately, Doug. But do you get the sense that once people and organizations that you've seen, at least the ones that you're measuring and year after year coming back and helping them fine tune that, it seemed that there'd be a momentum that would start to build where people get energized by the fact that the workplace is getting better and their scores start to reflect that.
Yeah, there's a couple of really self-reinforcing loops in there. One is inside the workplace, where as people are energized and engaged in the work, that leads to success, which leads to more energizing and more engagement. So that's kind of a virtuous circle. The other thing that happens is that great or top workplaces tend to attract better talent. And so that becomes another self-fulfilling prophecy or another virtuous circle. And that tends to re-energize the workplace. Now, I would say that you don't have to do this at the company level if you're in a very large company, and to our HR audience out here, in that if you're a HR business partner responsible for a department or division of your company or business unit, and you've got some autonomy around how you set your local culture, then you can also make that difference at that local level.
That's great to hear, because sometimes you think if you are working at a larger organization and you don't have a lot of input or say as to whether the overall organization would do a survey like this or start to track their own cultural indicators, you can do it at a local level, at your own divisional level or functional level. Is that right?
Yeah, we do that all the time, and so our research programs tend to be metro area based, and so we do them in Philly and Boston, Chicago. A lot of people live and work in cities around the country or metro areas, and so we'll do a division of a large company or a local office of a large company, and they can find out. And sometimes it's a great place to work in Philly, but not such a great place to work in Atlanta. So.
Interesting. It could be regional differences like that. And that shows the impact that leaders have, I guess, on the same organization, different locations, a local culture that they experience.
We can see pretty wide variation between cultures across geographies. Sure.
That's really indicative of the impact that leaders have on an organization.
Yep.
Well, Doug, fascinating discussion. Is there anything you'd say, any final thoughts or words of wisdom for our rising HR leaders? And is there anything you would suggest they do to try to really move the needle on the culture of their organization? Let's assume it's not a toxic place, but it's a good place. It's a fine place, but they want to really move the needle. What is some tangible steps they could take to make that happen?
So one of the things we've arranged to set up for your listeners is a top workplaces evaluation, which is free. And so as long as you have at least 50 employees, and you can designate an executive sponsor for the top workplaces evaluation, then if you go to the show notes, you can there'll be a link to the top workplaces website for this show, and so they can sign up for it, and we'll reach out and tell you whether you're a top workplace or not, and also give you a sense for where you stand.
That's awesome. That's tremendous. Thank you for doing that. And Doug, I want to again thank you today for coming on to the podcast and sharing with us your journey from rocket scientist to experts in engagement and culture, and what are the drivers behind that. I want to encourage our listeners who are not yet subscribers to HR Studio Podcast. Doug mentioned that we do have some offerings for you in the show notes from today. You can get more information about top workplaces, about that offer that Doug has generously extended to our subscribers to do a survey. And you can also subscribe to the show there, and also look at our prior episodes where we've interviewed people on a whole host of areas, including this topic of culture. So, Doug, once again, thank you so much today for your insight and your wisdom behind your organization and the cultures that you help improve.
Fred, it's a real pleasure to be on, and really just wish everybody here on in your audience just great luck with their cultures. Thanks,
Great.
Fred.
Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to the HR Studio Podcast. To download complimentary resources from this week's episode and to catch up on past episodes, please visit hrstudiopodcast.com. Subscribe to the HR Studio podcast list and social channels while there to receive alerts and recaps on all our episodes. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates. For over 35 years, AJO has built its reputation on experienced listening, exceptional quality, and caring partnerships, delivering in 30 states and 20 countries. To learn more and subscribe to AJO's Top 100 HR blog, visit us at ajoconnor.com.